Hello, everybody. I'm Mary Garton. I'm here on behalf of Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm just a volunteer, however, from the Ann Arbor chapter. We are a grassroots organization focused on major climate action, and a priority for us right now is changing the price of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are much cheaper than they ought to be because fossil fuel companies don't pay anything to fix all of these problems that they cause. We are the ones who pay higher insurance. We pay for property damage, new infrastructure. We pay the costs of political instability, etc. Fossil fuel prices should reflect these $62 billion of implied subsidies annually, but they don't. So we are subsidizing the cost of fossil fuels. Now, if we added a fee onto fossil fuels, then clean, non-polluting energy comes out cheaper. This drives the economy-wide transition to renewables. CCL supports carbon dividends to do that, to accelerate the solutions to climate change. We support the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and I'll go over what it does. A carbon dividend plan has two parts: putting a price on carbon and then giving that money back to American citizens. The carbon fee is the part that rapidly reduces emissions, and the dividend is what protects average Americans from higher prices. So first, I want to talk about carbon pricing and how that works. We would charge the fossil fuel companies a fee on oil, gas, and coal at the fossil fuel extraction point, which means at the well, the mine, or the first point of sale. To explain why the fees are collected so far upstream instead of, for example, a gas tax, the EPA here is showing us that carbon emissions occur all throughout the economy. A simple gasoline tax would only target 29% of emissions. So you want to assess the fees where the fossil fuels first hit the economy way upstream so that the electrical grid and industrial energy and the natural gas that heats our buildings, they all get reduced and all at the same time. It's easier to collect these fees way upstream because there are fewer places to do it. We don't need to hire a huge staff of people and build a bureaucracy just to test emissions on every smokestack and tailpipe. And because all of these sectors of the economy are downstream from the fee, all of these emissions are covered. So we would have the fee start low so that it doesn't shock the economy. We have seen with COVID how the economy suffers after a major sudden change. There needs to be time to adjust. So the fee starts low and it increases steadily every year. Now, this predictable increase allows industries and investors to see what's on the horizon and calculate how quickly fuel prices are going to be rising so that they can plan how they're going to reduce costs before the fee becomes substantial. The writing on the wall is what drives emissions down. It's the predictive value, not the pain. And here's the key: reducing energy costs also reduces emissions. The cost of fossil fuels will tell industries and businesses to reduce their energy use, but the decisions about exactly how to reduce energy use, well, that is made individually. That is made by everybody. That's why economists favor a carbon fee as the fastest and most efficient approach. All sectors of the economy move to cleaner energy, all at the same time. That's 210 million Americans making millions of big or even small money-saving decisions. But every day, that's what cuts fossil fuel use. This approach releases everyone's creativity to look for ways to reduce energy costs. There's incentive for innovators to reduce energy in appliances, homes, and in transportation in many and various ways. And there's incentive for consumers to seek out these innovations. So we have been hearing for a decade now about breakthroughs in the news almost every day. Better solar panels here, there's biofuel from algae, magnetic refrigerators, car charging, electric car charging that would take only 5 minutes, and many, many more examples. But then we don't hear about these inventions again because there's no incentive for investors to support these technologies and get them to market. A carbon price would change that. Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy studied the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. They concluded that implementing EICDA as a standalone policy, just this bill, would lead to emissions reductions of 36 to 38% by 2030. Most of the near-term reductions occur in the power sector, where emissions fall precipitously, and coal is nearly eliminated by 2030. Local air quality, especially in neighborhoods near power plants, is improved, with NOx declining by 75% and SOx and mercury declining by 95%. Now that is fast, which is so important because the sooner air quality improves, the more lives in these frontline communities will be saved from illnesses and death caused by air pollution. I'd like to show you a few scenarios from an MIT and collaborators modeling tool called En-ROADS. It's been used in briefings for US members of Congress, universities, local governments, businesses, the State Department, the Chinese government, and the UN Secretary General's office. This shows business as usual. That's this slide right here. Today, for simplicity, focus on the orange square. Right now, we're looking at a temperature increase of 3.6 degrees by 2100. So this is the forecasted temperature rise. The goal is 1.5 degrees, and this is Celsius, not Fahrenheit. So this is a bad forecast. This graph shows our ongoing increase in emissions. This curve needs to bend down steeply. So let's look at policies that phase out coal, oil, and gas and increase renewables. We get to 3 degrees, which is better, but it's not enough. We wanted 1.5. So let's add high incentives for pedestrian, bicycle, and public transport, and increase car, truck, shipping, air travel, train, and bus efficiency, and highly incentivize the purchases of electric vehicles. And then we improve energy efficiency and electrification for buildings. With all of that, we get to 2.5 degrees, which is still not enough. We want 1.5. However, if we go back to the business as usual model and only install a steadily rising carbon fee like the EICDA, we get the same result. That's just one bill. With a carbon tax on board, though, if we, on top of that one bill, we add energy efficiency, electrification incentives, and infrastructure for vehicles, buildings, and industry, we lower emissions even more. The model tells us we need to save forests, plant trees, and add some carbon capture in order to meet the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. But here's what worries me. If we try to do all of these other things separately and piecemeal, using only regulations and incentives without a carbon price, that's a lot of legislation to get passed in a very divided Congress. Each piece of legislation is difficult. All of that takes time. It takes time to pass, and it takes time to implement. The Clean Power Plan, while it was the best we could do in a divided Congress, I'm not going to argue that, it was signed in 2015. But the first enforceable carbon limits weren't scheduled to kick in until 2022. That was 7 years after it was passed, after it was signed. And that was because the administration that was required to put it in place. Then, to make matters worse, it wasn't even scheduled to ramp up to full effect until 2030. Well, it turns out that this plan never even got started. It never got off the ground because a polar opposite administration came into power and killed it before it could be implemented at all. So that was a lot of time spent to accomplish essentially nothing. So with our time window shrinking, we need to think strategically about speed. A carbon price, and in fact, this one, doesn't require much administration. So it's written to go into effect no later than 9 months after it gets passed. It will start having an effect immediately. It's clear that we need many solutions in play at the same time. We need more than just a carbon price, but the single most effective first step would be an economy-wide carbon price. This graph shows what happened during the brief period Australia had a carbon tax. In 9 months, emissions went down. Unfortunately, they didn't have a dividend, and that undermined support. The new government replaced the carbon price with incentives called the Emissions Reduction Fund. It took a long time to even begin to flatten this curve, and emissions now are way higher than after they dropped the carbon price. So business popularity. Because carbon pricing offers predictability instead of uncertainty, the US Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable call for carbon pricing, which is huge news. Support from business is essential to getting legislation passed. There are a number of conservative organizations who call themselves the eco-right who support carbon pricing. If we leverage these businesses and conservative citizen groups with Republicans in Congress, we have a good chance of getting meaningful legislation passed, which means getting it started sooner and hopefully not having policy get overturned immediately with the next administration. On the Democratic side, the US Senate Democrats Committee on the Climate Crisis and the US House Committee on Climate Crisis both said we need to include a carbon price as a tool in our climate action. The IPCC, the group of scientists who gave us that 1.5-degree goal that all of us accept, described a carbon price as a necessary condition of ambitious climate policy. Now, many of you may be familiar with something called Project Drawdown. It's a book and also a website, and I will take photos from the website. In Project Drawdown, over 100 solutions to climate change are presented with detailed information about the degree of benefit from each. The idea here is that there are many, many things we have to do or can do to get to a livable world. There are so many strategies. The author of Drawdown spoke to us in 2017, and we asked why carbon pricing wasn't listed as one of the 100 solutions in the book. His response was, because carbon pricing isn't a solution. Wind and solar and building efficiency, those are solutions. Carbon pricing is a policy that makes it easier and faster to get those solutions in place. So here is Project Drawdown founder and author Paul Hawken in Aspen.
There is no standard policy that would have the greatest impact or the greater impact than price by carbon. There's no question about it. There is not a single solution there except for the education of girls and empowerment of women that would not be empowered and accelerated by carbon pricing. That's what CCL does. I love your focus.
Okay, so we are needing, and in sort of in the middle of, but needing a green revolution. So there is fear among many Americans that they won't be able to afford a transition to clean energy, even though we can't afford not to. That's why the dividend is so important. In a carbon dividends plan, 100% of those fees that was collected upstream is sent back out to households as a monthly dividend. That means it's a check that they can spend any way they want. It arrives in the mail or with electronic funds transfer, very much the same way that your Social Security check arrives. To explain how this is progressive, this graph compares carbon footprints of people with progressively higher incomes. On average, the higher someone's income, so going rightward on this graph, the higher the CO2 emissions and the pollution that those people are responsible for. So on average, wealthier people travel more, they have bigger houses, they buy more stuff. Wealthier people are represented on the far right of the graph. And if you look at the wealthiest 2%, they actually use 4 times the energy use of people in the lowest first quintile. So when equal dividends are returned to people, those people who pollute less than average, so that means all of these people, they will not only be protected from increased costs, they'll end up getting back extra cash. Now, I do need to point out that no matter how we reduce emissions, whatever the policy, whether with a carbon tax or with a series of policies, it will cost something, somewhere, somehow. The energy revolution will not be free. It can't be free. A carbon tax is obvious about causing some cost increases, and that worries some people. But in fact, all policies that transition to clean energy will cost. We need to be on the lookout always for unintended consequences of any policies that end up causing vulnerable people to shoulder extra costs that they cannot afford. So back to the dividend, let's talk about the costs of the dividend, the increased costs first. 85% of those steadily rising fuel costs will get passed on to consumers. People will see some things getting more expensive. On the left, we have the lowest income families, or we will, and the highest incomers are going to be over here on the right. Now, costs that go up for people are gas and electricity, costs of high carbon purchases that will go up, and especially investments like stock portfolios and CDs. Those costs will go up. Now, wealthier people who on average buy more stuff and have more investments in fossil fuels are responsible for the most emissions. So their costs will go up substantially more than lower income folks. So this is how much average households will pay the first year in additional costs for all that stuff. But here are the dividends you get back. Now, I realize they look like different amounts. There's a wonky reason for this. They did start out as equal rebates, but because they are required by law to be taxed, poorer people will end up keeping more of it because they're in a lower tax bracket. At any rate, in green are the dividends that people will get back. Households in the bottom 20% do very well. They get much more cash back than their costs increase. On the lowest quintile, an average family there would spend an extra $273. On the other hand, they're going to get back $514, so that's not bad. This extra cash serves as an economic stimulus for local neighborhoods. The second and third quintiles also come out with extra cash. Even the fourth quintile just about breaks even. That means that the cost of this transition is not going to fall on the shoulders of those who can least afford it. It's those big energy users at the top who on average end up behind. And even then, it's not just because they're wealthy, it's as a consequence of too many greenhouse gases. Anybody who pollutes very little will see only a small rise in costs. The cost increase is a direct consequence of purchasing choices. It's really the most fair system out there. Financial investors will need to divest stock and retirement portfolios from fossil fuels, which right now are artificially appealing. Now, we have all been demanding that our universities divest, and that's a good thing. But actually, it's not just universities that need to divest. Everybody needs to. Now, this graph shows the first year. Every year, the carbon fee will rise. Some costs rise, and the dividends will also rise. Once the fee reaches $50, the average household would get $2,500 back as a dividend. The benefits are far beyond monetary, though, because many benefits cannot be monetized. The value of stopping climate change cannot be monetized. The value of immediately improved air quality near power plants and in smoggy cities, you can't put a price on that. Now, in the largest public statement of economists in history, 3,550 economists, every chair of the Federal Reserve from Obama's back to the Carter administrations, so I'm referring to Bernanke, Volcker, Yellen, and Greenspan. Nobel laureate economists and these others signed a statement saying that a steadily increasing tax is, quote, the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. All the revenues should be returned directly to US citizens through equal lump sum rebates. The majority of American families, including the most vulnerable, will benefit financially. Former Democratic candidates Pete Buttigieg and Andrew Yang also argued for this, as does the father of climate awareness, James Hansen, and Michael Mann, the climate scientist who first published the hockey stick graph. There's a great deal of support for this. Now, we need to throw everything at this problem. We need CAFE standards, the Clean Air Act, bans on fracking. We need to stop new natural gas infrastructure. We need to assist mining communities. We need to provide some assistance to research and development. There's a lot that we can do to help, but we also really, really need to have carbon dividends at the ground level as the most rapid and effective first step we can take. That is the end of my presentation for carbon fee and dividend.